And remember me and tell all your friends that you saw me right here at this Riverside Indian School.
Sitting Bull was born to the Lakota tribe of the Sioux Indians. The Sioux, along with other Native American tribes, had lived for centuries on an area of the Great Northern Plains encompassing large parts of North and South Dakota, Montana, Wyoming, and Nebraska. When Sitting Bull was born in 1831, the Sioux were a large group of autonomous tribes living nomadically on the plains. By the time of his death in 1890, the whites controlled everything. The Sioux population would be cut in half, their ancestral home usurped, and their way of life destroyed. The Sioux chose their leaders democratically, with even the women having a say. Sioux chiefs were chosen by the tribe, and were generally selected for their adherence to the 4 virtues of Sioux culture: bravery, fortitude, generosity, and wisdom. Sitting Bull excelled in these perhaps more than any other Sioux, but he is famous today not because of his prominence among the tribes, but because of his fierce resistance to westward expansion. The United States had been steadily conquering Indian territory for years, but only recently come into contact with the Sioux. Campaigns to pacify Sioux territory began during the Civil War. After the war, efforts to conquer the West redoubled. The Homestead Act was passed in 1862, offering free land to those who wanted to move west. And the Army promised to protect companies surveying territory for the railroads. Year after year, the Army tried to penetrate Sioux territory, committing more and more troops all the time. This conflict would come to be called Red Cloud's War. Both the war itself and the resulting treaty set the stage for Sitting Bull's rise to prominence. Red Cloud had fought a strong war, and he signed the Treaty of 1868, also called the Fort Laramie Treaty, which established the first reservations. The northern Sioux tribes were hardly even aware of the treaty, and were surprised when the U.S. began occupying Lakota territory ceded to them by Red Cloud. This incursion concerned the various Sioux chiefs so much that they gathered on the plains for a great council. At this meeting, the first in 30 years and the largest in Sioux history, Sitting Bull was elevated to a newly created position in tribal hierarchy. He was already chief of his Hunkpapa tribe, but in 1868 he became war chief of all the Sioux. Over the next 5 years, Sitting Bull and his personal war band led a fluid coalition of tribes who fought the U.S. Army wherever they found them. Constantly kept on their toes by Sitting Bull's hit-and-run tactics, the Army under William T. Sherman committed more and more troops. Eventually, the Sioux's stubborn resistance led the U.S. to back down for a while, and as a period of uneasy peace began, the tribes dispersed to more easily find food. It wasn't long before trouble brewed again. Prospectors found gold in the Black Hills, an area that was not only guaranteed to the Indians by the Treaty of 1862, but also sacred ground for the Sioux. Still, once the miners had come, the Army had to protect them. The next 2 years would come to be known as the Great Sioux War, as the U.S. tried every means to subdue the tribes and secure the West for their own gains. For the first time, the Army became proactive, venturing far from the forts to attack Sioux villages and deplete their food supply, the noble buffalo. When coordinated infantry thrusts failed to engage the Sioux in close combat, the Army brought in the 7th Cavalry to track the Sioux and exterminate those who refused to live on the reservations. The name of their commander, George Armstrong Custer, would be inextricably linked to Sitting Bull. In June of 1876, Custer set out to find Sitting Bull, who had become known as the center of Sioux resistance. Through the winter, Sitting Bull's band had dwindled to under 500 people, the majority women and children. While Sitting Bull struggled to hold his dwindling coalition together, his scouts warned him of Custer's march, and he knew his 200 or so warriors could not meet Custer's army of almost 1,000 men. One night, Sitting Bull dreamt of a great Sioux victory over the whites, and in the next few days, a miracle occurred. The return of good weather and the threat from the 7th Cavalry had inspired thousands of Sioux to leave the reservations and come join Sitting Bull on the plains. Within 6 days, Sitting Bull's war band had swelled from a group of fugitives to an army almost twice the size of Custer's. When part of the 7th Cavalry found Sitting Bull's village, it had swelled to almost 3,000 teepees, among them 1,800 fighting men. Custer's men opened the battle by firing into the village, killing and wounding over 100 non-combatants. But Custer had made the fatal mistake of splitting his forces. Over the next 36 hours, the Sioux got between the 3 separate battalions. They got behind the white troops, and then they rushed in among them. The night of the 26th, the remnants of the 7th withdrew to the east. They had lost more than 400 men, including Custer and his entire company. Sioux losses were estimated at 40 dead. Custer's last stand and the massacre of his command caused a huge uproar on the home front. The government turned Custer into a martyr and would never again have trouble fielding enough men to outnumber the Sioux. The Battle of the Little Bighorn was the high point of Sioux resistance. In the campaign of 1877, touting Sitting Bull as a dangerous Sioux renegade, the army was able to field thousands more men. By 1878, the majority of the Sioux had been concentrated onto 2 reservations. Sitting Bull, with a small band of followers, escaped to Canada, where they spent a few seasons hunting the ever scarcer buffalo and negotiating with the U.S. for Sioux autonomy. Finally, in 1881, on the brink of starvation, Sitting Bull surrendered to the U.S. government. The Winchester rifle he carried that day is enshrined in the nation's capital, a symbol of the fear he fostered in his conquerors. Sitting Bull continued to plead his case for 10 more years. He wanted only for his people to be allowed to return to the plains. The federal government remained intimidated by his appeal. For many, he came to represent the experience of all American Indians, and even whites admired him. In the 1880s, he spent some time traveling the U.S. working in Buffalo Bill's Wild West show and signing autographs for money. The late 1880s saw a resurgence in Native American culture in the form of the ghost dance movement. The movement was nonviolent, but the government still feared trouble, and when Sitting Bull threw his support behind the ghost dancers, an order went out for his arrest. At 6 a.m. on December 14th, government agents stormed Sitting Bull's camp, and in the ensuing fight, the great chief was killed. When word spread of Sitting Bull's death at the hands of the government, hundreds of Lakota fled the reservations in fear. A few days later, they were caught by U.S. troops near Wounded Knee, South Dakota. 200 unarmed Sioux were massacred. Open warfare with the Indians had come to an end. He never gave up his dream of a return to traditional Sioux life. To this end, he kept fighting for his people, always demanding to put his case before the president himself. In 1890, he wrote, "What treaty that the whites have kept has the red man broken? Not one. What treaty that the whites ever made with us red man have they kept? Not one. Who has ever come to me hungry and gone unfed? What law have I broken? Is it wrong for me to love my own? Is it wicked in me because my skin is red? Because I am a Sioux? Because I was born where my fathers lived? Because I would die for my people and my country?"